Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know, sometimes you hear about a problem and think, someone should really do something about that. Well, that's what we're looking at today. Ethical pest control.
It's more than just, getting rid of unwanted critters. It's about recognizing that even pests are living beings.
So it's about finding ways to manage them responsibly, without resorting to methods that cause unnecessary suffering.
Right, and trying to minimize the impact on the environment. A lot of people think of pest control as just spraying a bunch of chemicals. But it's so much more than that.
That's what we're going to get into today, the ins and outs of ethical pest control, why it's important, and what the future holds for this growing field.
Exactly. It's an exciting time to be involved in this industry. There's a lot of innovation happening, and people are finally starting to realize that there are alternatives to those harsh traditional methods.
So where do we even begin with this? What are some of the key things people need to understand about ethical pest control? Well, one of the biggest misconceptions is that humane pest control means just letting pests run wild. That's not the case at all. It's about finding that balance between managing pest populations while also minimizing harm and respecting their place in the ecosystem.
I think that's a really important point because a lot of people think it's an all or nothing situation. Either you kill all the pests or you just let them take over.
Exactly. But there's a whole spectrum in between. And ethical pest control is about finding that sweet spot.
So it's about finding solutions that work for everyone. Us,
Yeah.
the pests, and the environment.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because it requires us to think outside the box and come up with creative solutions that address the root cause of the problem.
Speaking of creative solutions, I've been hearing a lot about this company in Sydney called Trust Pest Control. They've been making waves for their commitment to ethical practices.
Oh, yeah. They're a fantastic example of a company that's really walking the walk. They prioritize customer education, they use humane trapping methods, and they have a really strict policy against using harmful chemicals unless it's absolutely necessary.
So they're not just talking the talk, they're actually putting these principles into practice.
Exactly. And it's working for them. They have a really loyal customer base. And they're proving that you can be both effective and ethical in this industry.
I think that's so important because for a long time, there was this perception that ethical pest control was somehow less effective.
Right. It was seen as a compromise. Like you were sacrificing results for the sake of being kind to animals.
But companies like Trust Pest Control are proving that's not the case at all.
Exactly, in many cases. The humane methods are actually more effective in the long run.
And they're certainly better for the environment and our own health.
Absolutely. So it's a win-win-win situation.
So how do they do it? What are some of the specific techniques and strategies that Trust Pest Control uses to achieve these results?
Well, one of their key principles is integrated pest management, or IPM. It's a holistic approach. That focuses on prevention and long-term solutions rather than just reacting to problems as they arise.
So it's about understanding the pest's life cycle, its behavior, and its environment.
Right, and then using a combination of methods to manage the population in a sustainable way.
That makes sense. So instead of just spraying pesticides everywhere, which can be harmful to other organisms and the environment.
Exactly. They might use things like physical barriers, traps, or even natural predators to control the pest population.
So it's about working with nature, not against it.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that every situation is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So it requires a lot of expertise and careful consideration.
It does, but the results speak for themselves. IPM is proven to be effective, and it's a much more sustainable approach in the long run.
So it's not just about being nice to the pests. It's about finding solutions that are good for everyone.
Exactly, and that's the beauty of ethical pest control. It's a win-win for all involved.
Okay, so we've talked about the principles of ethical pest control, and we've seen a great example of a company that's putting those principles into practice. But what about the challenges? Because I imagine it's not always easy to find that balance between effectiveness and humane treatment.
You're absolutely right. There are definitely some challenges inherent in ethical pest control, and that's what we'll be diving into next.
Perfect. I'm all ears.
Yeah, so, one of the biggest challenges is that sometimes the most humane methods aren't always the fastest or the easiest. Like in a perfect world, we could just gently relocate every critter that wandered into our homes. But it doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we could just relocate all the pests and everyone would live happily ever after. But the reality is a little more complicated.
Right, exactly. Like you have to think about where you're relocating them to, what the impact will be on that new environment, and whether they'll even be able to survive there.
It's like you're just shifting the problem from one place to another.
Yeah, and sometimes you might even be making things worse. Like if you relocate a bunch of rats to an area where they've never been before, they could end up spreading diseases or outcompeting native species for food and resources.
Right. So it's not as simple as just catching them and letting them go somewhere else.
Exactly. It requires a lot of careful planning and consideration, and sometimes relocation just isn't a viable option.
So what do you do in those cases?
Well, that's where things get tricky. You have to weigh the potential harm of leaving the pests unchecked against the potential harm of using more aggressive methods to control them.
So it's a balancing act.
It is, and sometimes there are no easy answers.
I imagine that can be really tough for pest control professionals.
It can be, especially when you're dealing with clients who are just looking for the quickest and cheapest solution.
Right, because not everyone is on board with the whole ethical pest control thing.
Exactly. Some people still view pests as just something to be exterminated,
Huh.
and they don't really care about the methods used as long as they get rid of the problem.
So how do you deal with those clients?
Well, it's all about education, trying to help them understand that there are alternatives to those traditional methods, and that those alternatives can be just as effective, if not more so in the long run.
And hopefully better for the environment and everyone's health in the long run.
Exactly. It's about changing mindsets. And that's not always easy.
No, it's not, but it's important work.
It is, and it's something that more and more pest control companies are starting to embrace.
That's good to hear. So what are some of the things that are driving this shift towards ethical pest control?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors is just growing public awareness. People are becoming more conscious of the impact of their actions on the environment, and they're starting to demand more sustainable and humane solutions.
That makes sense. And I think social media has played a big role in that too.
Definitely. It's easier than ever for people to share information and connect with others who share their values.
So it's creating a community of people who are committed to ethical pest control.
Exactly, and that's really powerful.
So what does the future hold for this movement?
I think it's only going to continue to grow as more and more people become aware of the benefits of ethical pest control, and as more companies start to offer these services.
And hopefully we'll see more innovation in this field.
Definitely, there's a lot of exciting research happening right now on new eco-friendly treatments and on ways to use technology to prevent pest problems before they even start.
So the future of ethical pest control is looking bright.
It is, and that's something to be optimistic about.
It is indeed. So we've talked about the challenges of ethical pest control, and we've explored some of the reasons why this movement is gaining momentum. But I think the big question on everyone's mind is, what can we do about it? How can we as individuals contribute to this shift towards a more humane and sustainable approach to pest control?
That's a great question, and it's something that we'll be diving into in the next part of our discussion. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of ethical pest control, and we've explored some of the reasons why this movement is gaining momentum. But the big question is, what can we do about it? How can we as individuals contribute to this shift towards a more humane and sustainable approach to pest control?
That's what I was just thinking. Like, it's all well and good to talk about these big ideas, but what can we actually do in our own lives to make a difference?
Well, the good news is that there are a lot of things we can do, both big and small.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, one of the most important things is to become a conscious consumer.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, doing your research before you hire a pest control company.
Okay, so like checking out their website, seeing what kind of methods they use.
Exactly. Look for companies that specifically mention humane practices, eco-friendly treatments, or integrated pest management.
So making sure that their values align with ours.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Like what kind of questions?
Like what kind of products do they use? Do they have experience with humane trapping? What's their approach to prevention?
So basically interviewing them to make sure they're a good fit.
Right, because you're trusting them with your home
Right.
and with the well-being of your family and pets.
That makes sense. So it's about being proactive and informed.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of word of mouth.
Oh yeah, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors.
And spread the word about ethical pest control. The more people who demand these services, the more readily available they will become.
So it's about creating a demand for these kinds of solutions.
Exactly. And that leads to another important point, which is prevention.
Okay, so like stopping the pests from getting into our homes in the first place.
Right, because that's always the best approach.
So what are some things we can do to prevent pests?
Well, a lot of it comes down to basic sanitation.
Like keeping our homes clean.
Exactly. Things like storing food properly, cleaning up spills promptly, and not leaving pet food out overnight.
So basically not making our homes attractive to pests.
Precisely because if they can't find food or shelter, they're less likely to stick around.
Makes sense. Any other tips for prevention?
Yeah, definitely check your home for any potential entry points.
Like cracks in the foundation
Yeah,
or gaps around windows and doors.
right. Seal up any openings you find with caulk or weather stripping.
So it's like we're building a fortress against pests.
Exactly. And it's a much more humane approach than trying to get rid of them once they're already inside.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. And it's about taking responsibility for our own role in pest management.
I like that. So we've talked about being conscious consumers, and we've talked about prevention. Any other advice for our listeners?
Yeah, one last thing. If you do end up needing to hire a pest control company, be sure to communicate your preferences clearly.
Like telling them that you're looking for humane and eco-friendly options.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for specific details about the products and methods they use.
So it's about being an active participant in the process.
Right? You're not just hiring them to do a job. You're partnering with them to find a solution that works for everyone.
I love that. It's about collaboration and communication.
Exactly. And it's about empowering ourselves to make informed choices.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I've learned so much about ethical pest control, and I'm feeling really inspired to make a difference in my own life.
That's great to hear. And remember, every little bit helps.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the deep dive. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of ethical pest control and that you're feeling empowered to make more conscious choices in your own lives. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.